that is breaking at this hour. We told you first, and it's now official, the government has made the first move to repeal the controversial retrospective amendment to Section 9 of the Income Tax Act. A panel under Justice Easwar has been set up to review the income tax laws and make them simpler. Nayantara Rai, who broke that story earlier, joins in now with the details. Nayantara, so what will be the mandate of this panel?
Subi, let me just take you through the events of the day. We understood today morning that the Finance Ministry is very keen, or rather is actively considering the repealing the controversial retro tax. Then I understood from my sources that this entire task was being assigned to Jayant Sinha because if you remember, the Finance Minister Arun Jaitley has recused himself from the Vodafone case, and you can't really resolve the retro tax case unless you have Vodafone in the ambit as well. So that's what I was told by my sources is the reason why Jayant Sinha has been given this task. What I also understood from my sources was that a commission, that Jayant Sinha and the government may lean towards setting up a committee to look into this controversy, something the government also did very recently with the MAT controversy, where it set up the AP Shah-led panel and then took the recommendations after a few changes. Now we understand, and this is not confirmed, whether the new committee that you're just talking about is also going to be looking at the retrospective tax. What we do understand from the terms of reference of this committee is that it's going to be looking at the Income Tax Act of 1961, and it's going to be looking at how to make it more easy, how to make it easier to do business in the country, how to reduce litigation in the country. I would like to clarify at this juncture that as of now, we don't know if that controversial Section 9 is part of the terms of reference that have been given to this new commission. But like I said, what we understand is that this government is wanting to repeal the Retro Tax Act, and in fact, you know, we've been speaking to a whole host of global companies. For example, Boeing told CNBC TV 18 very recently that it's not going to be easy for the global board to invest large sums of money just on verbal assurances that new retrospective tax cases will not be opened up. And so we have this reference with the committee that I was just talking about, which says that it will be committed, entrusted with the task to suggest alternatives and modifications in existing provisions in order to bring about predictability and certainty in tax laws without substantial impact on tax base and revenue collection. So, like I said, no clarification, nothing specified if the retrospective tax is part of this, but you know, it is one of the biggest controversies that is out there. So far, the government has earned a single rupee from the Vodafone case, so it's very difficult to believe that in case it is set to repeal the Retro Tax Act, it's going to impact the revenue base of the government. With that, it's back to you, Sylvie.
All right, Nayantara, stay there. In fact, before we get more details into this conversation and some more perspective, let's just remind you, speaking to CNBC's Jeff Cutmore in September, Finance Minister Jaitley had hinted that a judicial committee could review tax laws and the controversial retrospective amendment as well.
We know the tax dispute has run on for many years, involving companies like Shell and Vodafone and Cairn Energy. You have said recently you're very close to a resolution of these disputes.
I tell you.
Can you tell us what is going to happen next that ends this?
We now have about 3 issues pending before us. And I'm looking at each of those 3 issues. They are all pending in courts as to the best way to get an expeditious disposal as far as those 3 issues are concerned, and these relate to the companies that you are mentioning. I'm seized of the problem, and we are very eager to have a resolution. The resolution could be by a judicial tribunal, the resolution could be by some discussion within, or similar methods that we've used to settle other disputes.
But they will be resolved.
I am certain, because it's necessary in the larger interest of our economy to resolve these issues, because tax instability doesn't help the investment environment. And therefore, we want the entire instability over pending taxation issues to be resolved.
Well, that was the exclusive interview that you got on CNBC in September. But Nayantara, coming back to you, as you mentioned, the government has been making fairly conciliatory noises all throughout the last couple of months on matters of taxation. We saw how it buried the hatchet on the MAT issue, and it seems now it might be willing to look at a broader ambit in terms of any sort of retrospective amendments that have been made in the recent past.
That seems to be exactly the case, Surbhi. And when you talk about retrospective, the biggest controversy and the biggest controversial one is, of course, Section 9 of the 1961 Income Tax Act, which was done post the Supreme Court order on Vodafone. It doesn't get bigger and more controversial than that amendment that was made. And like we reported in the morning, it did seem as the government was once again going to lean towards a committee, which would perhaps be a judicial commission, to try and arrive at a consensus. Also, don't forget, for this to take place, in case the government does go ahead to repeal this, it will have to perhaps do in the budget session, because this is very much of the Finance Act. In fact, I think we have a guest with us. Surbhi, so I'll let you hand it over to the guest before I step in with questions.
Sure. We do have Mr. Pranav Satya of EY joining in. Mr. Satya, thanks for taking this call. So this is news coming in, and we've been reporting here at CNBC TV 18 that there will be this judicial panel that would be set up, and that's the confirmation that has come through. It's not very specific. The press release does not tell us that it will indeed be looking at issues of retrospective taxation, but it does say that this panel will try and look at possible amendments to the IT Act that might make doing business a little simpler. Your first thoughts?
I think it's a great move. 2-3 very quick thoughts would be: one, the very initiative, the motive, the objective seems very, very welcome to try and review certain provisions which are litigious, which are ambiguous, which hamper ease of doing business. So that very thought is very much in line with being a business-friendly and taxpayer-friendly environment in India. Second, even the mix and the way in which the committee has been formed, I think it's a great mix. Right from Justice Easwar, who's one of the most respected former judges, to the law secretary, to some of the advisory people from the advisory fraternity on the panel. So I think it's a great mix, both from business and from the government. And I would feel it's a great beginning indeed.
Mr. Satya.
Okay, so you like the composition, Mr. Satya. Thanks a lot for joining us here. Nayantara here. I wanted to ask you specifically about the terms of reference, where it says the committee is entrusted with the task to suggest alternatives and modifications in existing provisions in order to bring about predictability and certainty in tax laws without substantial impact on tax base and revenue collection. So, in the terms of reference, just like the MAT one, are not clear-cut, they're not very specific, but what to your sense would it entail when you're talking about alternatives, modification, not changing the tax base? Would you like us be reading into the fact that this is to do with Section 9, it is to do with the retro tax?
No, I do not think this is to do with the retro tax in particular. I think it is more generic. It is to deal with various aspects of the Income Tax Act, I would feel, which are revenue neutral by and large. It's not to give any specific relief to taxpayers in terms of tax exemptions and so on, or benefits, but anything that is ambiguous and which could result in very long drawn-out litigation may prospectively be amended in order to bring about clarity as to how the provision is going to be interpreted for taxpayers to have certainty and predictability. I do not think it is about
How is it not revenue neutral, Mr. Satya? I want to understand that because, the government had lost the case even in the Supreme Court with respect to Vodafone, for example. So how can we clearly say that Section 9 is out of it? And which are some of the other sections or the other laws that you think that this committee is going to be looking at?
So it would be, I think the mandate would be pretty much every ambiguity in the Income Tax Act, and I do not think it is specific to Section 9. I wouldn't say that Section 9 is totally ruled out, but I do not think this, we have to wait and see, but I do not think this is aimed at Section 9 or the retrospectivity in particular. I think it is aimed at generally bringing about clarity, certainty, reducing ambiguity in the income tax law overall. And this would encompass every single provision of the law, the Income Tax Act.
Okay, so that's the new commission that's been set up to simplify the Income Tax Act. Thanks, Mr. Saitha, for taking the time and joining us here on CNBC TV 18. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Surbhi.
Thanks for that, Nayantara. Let's take a quick break.